Modernity is Making You Sterile, Rage Against Our Demographic Doom, published May 7th of this year. Cassava is a woody shrub native to South America, Perry writes. For people living in drought-prone tropical regions, it is a godsend, delicious, calorie-dense, and highly productive. The indigenous peoples of the Americas who first cultivated cassava are reliant on it and have developed an arduous days-long process of preparation that involves scraping, grating, washing, and boiling the plant before it is eaten. At the beginning of the 17th century, the Portuguese introduced cassava to the Old World, but they did not import the ancient methods of processing, assuming that indigenous people were wasting their time. We do not always know why we do the things we do. This applies as much to indigenous peoples as to modern Westerners. The first cultivators of cassava could not explain why the scraping, grating, washing, and boiling process was necessary, but because they did not know, could not know, that every step of the process is essential in order to reduce the cyanide content in the plant. If even one step is skipped, chronic cyanide poisoning is the result. And the really devilish thing about cassava poisoning is that the buildup of cyanide in the body is so gradual that it is almost impossible to identify cassava as the culprit. That's the problem with what we all think of as progress. It swats away benevolent traditions because the usefulness of traditions can be subtle and hard to understand. Technology brings many blessings: better medical treatment, better nutrition, and better comfort for all of the world's population, even in the poorest regions. But rapid technological development liquefies well-established traditions, and sometimes we don't realize what we've lost until it's too late. So that preamble reads, I mean, it's very much the message of our book, of course. We don't happen to tell the story of cassava in A Hunter-Gatherer's Guide to the 21st Century, but we tell many others that are like that. And the message is one that, of course, we resonate with because we were teaching that. We've been teaching that for decades, and is what we wrote into our book.
Yeah, in fact, it lines up with both literally false, metaphorically true,
That's right,
and Chesterton's fence, which
That's right,
both play a large role in our book.
Yes. Chesterton's fence, for those who are new to listening, or to us, being it's I guess a parable from G.K. Chesterton, a early 20th century philosopher, writer, thinker, who tells a little story about two guys walking along and running into a fence. One of them says, "It's in the way, let's get rid of it." The other one says, "What's it here for?" He says, "I don't know, let's get rid of it." He says, "You don't get rid of it until you know what it's there for. Only if you know what it's there for and can establish that the reason that it's there is no longer relevant, then we can talk about whether or not you can get rid of it. Until and unless you know why it's there, you don't touch it." So it's a inverse while pushing in the same direction as the precautionary principle.
Yep.
So you can, if you would give me my screen back here for a second. She goes through an analysis that we've got vast fertility declines, especially in the weird world, Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic. We have, actually, I'm not sure that we've talked publicly about the reality, actually, that there are two simultaneous population crises on the planet that go in opposite directions and yet completely do not cancel each other out. And so, she's talking about the fertility declines, which suggest a looming demographic disaster. But it's also true that there are too many people on the planet to be supported in a manner that can allow us all to be healthy, eating good food, having access to the kinds of things that most Westerners want access to.
Yeah, I would, because I know what trouble we're going to get in over that claim, I would say the point is really a consumption. There's too much consumption, and the problem is that the technology to allow that number of people to coexist on the planet without consuming at a rate that is unsustainable doesn't yet exist. Now, it's not inconceivable that it could, but at the moment, it seems like too many people because the rate of consumption requires a destructive interaction with the planet.
Yes.
Like that.
Okay, so then she talks about some of the ways, not all of the ways. We actually talk about a number of other ways that modernity is affecting our standard of our quality of life, but also our fertility. And she talks about some of them, and one of them she puts on the doorstep of modern feminism, the kind of feminism, sort of third wave feminism. She doesn't call it that, but that I always used to call faux feminism, F-A-U-X feminism, not F-O-E, although it kind of works either way. But this sort of feminism that forgets history, forgets what we are, just wants to prioritize doing what you do when you want to do it, and looks really naive as a result. Perry frames this as a kind of freedom first, like freedom, individual freedom as the primary thing that is desirable in feminism. And she writes, we need to marry modernity with a culture that promotes and supports parenthood. And you can show my screen if you want, but you don't have to because it's just one paragraph. A feminism that prioritizes freedom above all other values will never be able to achieve this goal, which is why we need to be fashioning a feminism oriented towards care and interdependency. Orientated, she writes. And if we are going to attempt this, then we will need to look at people of other times and places with new eyes, and rather than assuming that they were all bad and stupid, as the progress narrative does, instead thinking carefully about which norms and institutions actually serve the interests of women. In pre-modern Europe, women would remain in their homes for the first 40 days after giving birth, in a period known in English as lying in. Initially, they would stay in their beds and in their bedrooms with female relatives, neighbors, and for the wealthy servants, temporarily moving into the home and tending to their needs and the new babies. Okay, if I might have my screen back now. She then advocates for this, and she reports on how demanding very early motherhood is, and how she herself ended up being alone in some medical need, but also with a newborn after her husband went back to work, and advocating for, basically both antibiotics and lying in. And I read about the lying in thing, which I've heard before, and I think I literally shuddered with horror. As you can imagine,
yes.
I would have.
Wouldn't have been your thing.
The idea that you would be literally imprisoned in your home, not allowed to go outside in the month or month and a half after your child was born, sounds like complete hell to me, and also sounds deeply, deeply unhealthy. Will there be circumstances of the birth, of the pregnancy, of the baby, of what is happening outside the home, where that might be exactly what is warranted? Sure, absolutely. But for most women whom I knew, who had relatively easy pregnancies and relatively easy births and had healthy babies, the idea that you should be stuck first in your bedroom and then in your home and not going outside with your new baby, and that means the new baby doesn't get to go outside either, doesn't get to get any sunlight on his face, doesn't feel fresh air, anything, that looks like a recipe for ill health, for disease, actually. And again, there may be circumstances in which that lying in period would be good, but the idea of, oh, we need to go back to that. No, we do not. The idea that we should be recognizing that isolating new mothers with newborns, especially if they have no support, especially if they also have reason that they shouldn't be moving around very much, is of course going to make it harder on new mothers. And you might see, for instance, a rise in, postpartum depression. Obviously, this is a problem of the way that we are encouraging people to mother now, as opposed to something that was going on 5,000 years ago, 10,000 years ago. How common was postpartum depression 5,000 years ago? Not very, right? It wasn't a thing. And no, I can't have the data to support that, but I am certain of this.
So there's a lot. I mean, it's not surprising.
Yeah.
Mary Harrington and Louise Perry are friends, and obviously there's a lot of overlap in their perspectives. And this reminds me a little bit of the conversation that I had with Mary Harrington. And, there's a question. There's nowhere to go back to.
Right.
One has to go forward. Going forward is a problem because of the precautionary principle, which is not easy to adhere to, because of Chesterton's fence, which is not easy to adhere to. Right. But at some level, we need to get serious about solving this problem. What do you do when the current way is not viable? Backwards doesn't work for various reasons, because we don't live in the same place, for one thing.
But also, it wasn't all that.
Well, let's put it this way.
Some ancient traditions are awesome.
Yeah.
But the idea that traditional gender roles are what we should be aspiring to is anathema to a lot of people who aren't crazy insane with third wave feminism.
Yep. There's nowhere to go back to. There just literally isn't. And so there's a question about how you deal, without oversimplifying the problem, how you deal with the discovery of a new way that does retain the values that were correctly prioritized in the old ways without ever being explained, right? How you hybridize that with a new world in which some of the parameters have simply radically shifted. That's not an easy job. And one of the things I greatly appreciated about Mary Harrington was that she was absolutely ready to have that discussion.
Right.
She has a bias about effectively thinking that not only should we go back, but we should go back farther than we think. But the discussion that ensued around the question of, well, that is actually not possible. What do we do going forward, given that, for example, birth control is going nowhere, right? That is a radical change, and it alters the entire landscape here. You know, what would it look like to succeed going forward in defining a new mechanism for being that preserved what used to exist that worked and replaces that which used to work and doesn't anymore, or what doesn't work in the present?
I guess I will also say, I don't think it's a hedge, but just anecdotally with regard to our situation. In the case of both of our boys' births, my mother came up either just in advance or to her great sorrow hours after after the birth, and stayed for many weeks. You are as active and participatory a co-parent as any man I have ever met. And even at that stage where there was a lot of stuff to do with parenting that you just don't have the anatomy and physiology to do, you were very, very present. And also, there were a number of mostly women, but also some men at what was still a functional college that was both of our employers at that time. And in both cases, they organized and brought in a number of, a couple of weeks of dinners for us. And so we did have some support. Now, during the day, I was strapping the baby to me and going out on walks because that was what I needed to do. That was what felt healthy. But without you being who you were, without my mother there, without the support of our friends and colleagues, it would have felt a very, very different thing. And so there is no argument. I would never make an argument, nor would I think it would be sane to do so, that a woman should just go into motherhood totally solo and expect it's going to be fine. That makes no sense.
Yeah, that has never made any sense. Yeah. I would also point out, though, that it's weird, the idea of laying in, right? Okay, that's some arbitrary moment in the past in some particular continent. But
she argues that it, and I don't know that this is true, but she argues that it was nearly ubiquitous across cultures. I have not run into that before, but that is the argument in this piece.
Well, then here's the question. Okay, virtually every hunter-gatherer society, maybe even every hunter-gatherer society, at least the ones I'm aware of, babies are carried passively as mothers go on about their hunting and gathering, right? And this has lots of potential benefits, right? For one thing, there's lots of subtle stuff that gets communicated, rhythms of life, kinds of things, just the experience of, we spend a certain amount of time in this kind of activity or that kind of activity. The one of the ones I found most interesting was that babies and mothers establish a kind of communication about the baby's need to poop and piss that allows for a diaperless world in which you're not constantly running into terrible things because, when the baby needs to go, it subtly lets its mother know this. The mother finds an appropriate place. No diaper is necessary. Yeah. This becomes impossible in a modern society.
In the land of sheets.
Right. In the land of elevators and offices and sidewalks and all sorts of things that then result in us making the very terrible choice to effectively tape the feces to the baby. That's not a normal thing to do, but it also results in the baby losing touch. So if a baby would naturally be in touch with its own need to excrete things, and then it loses touch with it because we effectively cannot allow the baby to be doing that anywhere and everywhere, as a hunter-gatherer could, then we have to reteach them, these things, which is an unnatural and broken mechanism. And
it's
so
fun for no one.
Fun for no one. Yes. But anyway, the point is, where are we? Well, you can't go back, right? We are stuck with the fact that many people live in modern circumstances where they can't just behave like a hunter-gatherer. Going back to a laying-in period indoors where, I'm sure that if you were laying in...
I think it's lying in, at least as she spells it here.
All right. Lying in. If you were lying in, presumably in Europe, how many hundred years ago are we talking about?
Until relatively recently, but I think she may have said medieval. I'm not sure.
Medieval. So, at the very least, certainly if it was winter, probably almost any time, there'd be a fire, which, has some sort of positive benefit. The point is, we are at an arbitrary place in technology all the time, right? And that arbitrary place...
This is a very important point, actually, that it feels to everyone, presumably, like we've arrived. We are here. We are the moderns. We have arrived. And from here on out, it looks the same going forward. But man, there's a lot of change. Yesterday looked different, and a week ago looked really different, and a month, and wow. But good to have arrived right now, right here, because now things stop.
Now we're modern. You can relax. Which turns out not to be true.
Right.
Have I introduced you to the AI? But yeah, we are now always somewhere arbitrary. And so what the upshot of that is necessarily as fraught with danger as picking and choosing from the arbitrary collection of options is, and it's not going to be good. I mean, she opens with a killer point in this piece, right? The Cassava story is definitely a beautiful example of the Chesterton Spence issue.
No, and the hubris, which until recently was always, those natives, they just don't know what they're doing. And now it is revealed that, like, actually the hubris goes every way, all the time, constantly. We're always assuming we know more than we actually do. And maybe don't mess with that until you, never mind.
The natives don't know what they're doing. Go nixtamalize yourself.
You might want to spell that out.
It's a corn processing methodology that makes the beast properly digestible. And
did you say beast?
Yes. You don't think corn is a beast?
No.
All right.
And it's referred to as liming.
Yep.
Right. The liming of corn.
In any case, I think and you and I spell this out really directly in the book. Can't go back. There's nowhere to go back to. And going forward is not going to be there's not a method for doing that in a way that is without carnage. But, going back, full of carnage. Going forward is going to be full of carnage. The question is, how do you minimize that amount of carnage and not keep repeating the same errors, right? How do you learn from those errors? And, at some level, rein in the impulse to embrace the new because it does seem improved. Right? Compact fluorescent light bulbs. Really? You want to stop eating tuna? You've got mercury that's suddenly in the environment at such a level that tuna fish is a concern. That really shouldn't be. Let's replace it with LEDs. LEDs, they're super efficient. That'll be great for our carbon footprint. But, how is it for our physiological health?